Imagine waking up chained to a stranger in a space so low you cannot sit upright. The air is thick with vomit, salt water, and the smell of 200 bodies packed into a hold built for cargo, not men. You cannot see the sun. You do not know how many days have passed. This is not a horror film. This is the lower deck of a slave ship in the year 1720, and it was real for more than 12 million people. But here is the part of the story most documentaries leave out. This floating hell did not just produce victims. It produced some of the most feared rebels in maritime history. Men who had already survived the worst thing the ocean could do to a human being, walked off those ships or seized them outright and became the backbone of the Golden Age of Piracy. Today, we are going into the hold, into the psychology of terror and defiance, to understand exactly how the machinery built to break the human spirit ended up forging it into something the British Empire could not control. Before we go below deck, if stories like this, the real, unfiltered history hiding behind the pirate flag, are your kind of thing, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists for exactly this, the history the movies never show you. Now, let's go down into the hold. To understand why slave ships bred rebellion, you first have to understand what they actually were. They were not simply transport vessels. They were engineered systems of psychological destruction, and every plank, chain, and ration was designed with one goal: to convert a free human being into obedient cargo before the ship ever reached port. The journey was called the Middle Passage, the brutal middle leg of the transatlantic slave trade, running roughly 6 to 10 weeks from the West African coast to the Americas. On a typical vessel, several hundred captives were packed below decks in spaces sometimes less than 18 inches high. Men were chained in pairs at the wrist and ankle, forced to lie on bare wooden shelves that left permanent scars on their skin from the friction of the rocking ship. There was no room to turn over without waking the person chained beside you. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Buckets served as toilets for dozens of people, and in rough seas, those buckets overturned, leaving the enslaved to lie in their own waste for days. Ship surgeons and captains of the era wrote in their own logs that survive today, about the necessary tubs overflowing and the deck below resembling what one slave ship surgeon called a slaughterhouse. Dysentery, known on these ships as the bloody flux, killed thousands. Smallpox, measles, and scurvy tore through the packed hold, because a single sick body in that airless space meant almost guaranteed transmission to everyone chained nearby. Mortality rates tell their own story. Historians estimate that on average, somewhere between 12 and 20% of captives died during the crossing. On some voyages, especially in the earlier, less regulated decades of the trade, the death toll climbed above 40%. That means on a ship carrying 400 people, it was entirely ordinary for 50, 80, sometimes over 150 of them to die before the anchor ever dropped in the Caribbean. But the physical torment was only half the design. The other half was psychological, and it was just as deliberate. Enslavers understood that a captive who still had a name, a language, a family, and a community was a captive who still had a reason to resist. So the system worked to strip all of it away. People from dozens of different ethnic groups and language communities, the Akan, the Igbo, the Wolof, the Congo, and many others, were deliberately mixed together on the same ship. This was not an accident of logistics. Slave traders openly wrote that mixing language groups made organized revolt harder, because captives who could not speak to each other could not easily plan together. Names were erased. Family units were split apart, often on purpose to shatter any existing bonds of loyalty or protection before the ship even left the African coast. Branding with hot irons marked captives as property, not people. Everything about the voyage was engineered to communicate a single message: you are no longer a person. You are a commodity, and any structure of resistance you might build has already been dismantled in advance. And yet, despite every one of these calculated cruelties, the historical record shows something the traders did not expect. Shipboard revolts happened constantly. Modern research drawing on transatlantic slave trade databases has documented well over 400 confirmed shipboard rebellions between the 16th and 19th centuries, and historians agree that number is almost certainly an undercount, since many uprisings were never recorded or were crushed and buried in ships' logs. On some documented voyages, insurance records from the period show ship owners specifically raising premiums for routes out of regions like the Bight of Biafra and Senegambia because crews there had a well-earned reputation for revolt. This is the paradox sitting at the center of our story. The very system built to guarantee total submission was, at the same time, manufacturing the most battle-hardened, loss-hardened, fear-hardened human beings on the Atlantic. When a person has already survived the absolute floor of human suffering, has already watched people die chained beside them, has already lost everything that once defined their identity. The ordinary threats that kept a merchant sailor obedient simply stop working. You cannot threaten a man with death when he has already been living inside it for 6 weeks. And that single psychological fact is the hinge on which the rest of this story turns. Here is where the story pivots, and where most retellings of pirate history get it wrong. The common myth is that pirates were simply criminals who chose a life of plunder. The truth, for a meaningful number of the Golden Age's most dangerous crews, is that piracy was the first taste of self-determination many of these men had ever been allowed. When pirate ships attacked slave vessels, and they did frequently because a slave ship was a rich target loaded with valuable cargo and desperate crew, the pirates faced a decision the Royal Navy never had to make. What do you do with several hundred captive human beings sitting in the hold of the ship you've just seized? Some pirate captains sold the captives onward, choosing profit over principle, but a significant number of documented crews did something else. They offered the freed captives a choice: join the crew as an equal member under the ship's articles, sharing in votes and in plunder, or be set ashore free at the next port. This was not universal, and it was not always noble, but it happened often enough that historians studying crew records have concluded that a meaningful share of Golden Age pirate crews on certain ships included formerly enslaved Africans. In numbers, historians estimate at times reached a quarter to a third of the crew. Why would pirate captains, who owed no one anything, extend this kind of offer? Because it made brutal practical sense. A pirate crew's survival depended on absolute reliability in a fight, and the men who had endured the Middle Passage had already been tested by something worse than naval cannon fire. They had nothing left to lose, and for the first time since their capture, something concrete to protect: a share of the plunder, a vote in the ship's decisions, and a document, the pirate articles, that, on paper, treated them as equals to the captain himself. This is the psychological mechanism worth sitting with. Trauma researchers today describe a phenomenon where extreme, prolonged powerlessness can produce two very different outcomes in survivors: complete collapse or a hardened refusal to ever again submit to captivity. For those who reached the deck of a pirate ship still standing, the second outcome dominated. These were not men easily frightened by a naval broadside or a hangman's noose, because they had already stared down worse in the dark of a slave ship's hold. Colonial officials of the period noted this directly in trial records that captured black pirates, when brought before the court, showed a defiance that unsettled prosecutors used to frightened confessions. Several accounts describe men who mounted the gallows in open defiance rather than pleading for mercy. The same hardened composure that had carried them through the crossing now carried them through their execution. The pirate code itself reflected this hunger for a different kind of order. Aboard most Golden Age pirate ships, the captain held absolute authority only in battle. Everywhere else, power was distributed. An elected quartermaster checked the captain's authority. Plunder was divided by a fixed and transparent share system, and major decisions were put to a vote of the entire crew, regardless of a man's origin. For someone who had been treated as property with no voice at all, a single vote, an equal vote, was not a small thing. It was the exact inversion of everything the slave ship had been built to enforce. There is also a purely mechanical reason slave ships mattered so much to the story of piracy, and it has nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with engineering. Slave ships were, by the standards of the era, built for speed. A slower crossing meant more days of feeding hundreds of captives, more days of disease spreading through the hold, and more days of profit margin eroding. So shipbuilders designed slavers with sleek hulls and generous sail plans built to cut weeks off the Atlantic crossing. That same design made them extremely attractive targets for capture, because a fast hull that could outrun a naval patrol as a slave ship could outrun a naval patrol just as well, flying under a different flag. When a pirate crew seized a slave ship, they were not just seizing cargo, they were often seizing one of the fastest hulls on the ocean. Several notable pirate vessels of the era began their working lives in the slave trade before being repurposed for piracy, refitted with additional gun ports and a stripped-down cargo hold to maximize speed and firepower. The horror chamber built to transport captives efficiently across an ocean became, in pirate hands, a warship capable of outrunning almost anything the Royal Navy could send after it. This is part of why the ships that live on in pirate legend, vessels remembered as nearly uncatchable, so often trace their origins back to the slave trade's obsession with speed. The very qualities that made a ship efficient at the trade in human beings were the same qualities that made it deadly once turned against that trade's own enforcers. No single story captures this transformation better than the man history remembers as Black Caesar. According to the accounts that survive, pieced together from colonial records and the retellings of contemporaries, Caesar was a West African leader who evaded slave traders for years before finally being lured aboard a ship under false pretenses, packed below decks, and carried out to sea. As the vessel approached the Florida coast, it was struck by a hurricane. In the chaos, Caesar and a single sympathetic crew member survived, escaping in a longboat loaded with supplies and weapons, while the rest of the ship went down. What Caesar did next is the part of the story that matters most for us. He did not simply seek safety. He built a career on the exact skills the ocean had just tested in him: patience, calculated risk, and an unshakable resistance to fear. Operating out of the mangrove inlets of the Florida Keys, he and his partner lured passing ships by posing as shipwreck survivors, then robbed them once they came close enough to help. Over time, Caesar built his own crew and, according to multiple historical accounts, eventually joined the company of Edward Teach, Blackbeard himself, serving in the final campaign of one of history's most notorious pirate captains. Caesar's story is not unique in its shape, even if it is unique in its details. Historians who have studied crew composition during the Golden Age note that a striking number of Atlantic pirate captains sailed with meaningfully large numbers of black crew members, in some documented cases close to half the crew, many of them men who had escaped slavery or been freed from captured slave ships. This was not because pirate crews were free of the racism of their era. It was, in large part, because a pirate ship's articles offered something almost nowhere else on the Atlantic offered a black sailor in 1720, a formal share of the plunder, a vote in the crew's decisions, and as harsh and lawless as pirate life was, protection under the same code that governed every other man aboard. That is the through line connecting Caesar to hundreds of nameless men whose stories never made it into a written trial record. The hold of a slave ship taught them what absolute powerlessness felt like, and by the time they reached a pirate deck, they were done accepting it. The slave ship was designed to manufacture obedience. Instead, in case after case, it manufactured rebellion, the same physical extremity that was meant to break the human spirit produced men who had already survived captivity's worst weapon and could no longer be controlled by the threat of it. The same ships built for speed and profit became, in pirate hands, the fastest instruments of defiance on the Atlantic, and the same system that stripped men of their names, their languages, and their communities inadvertently created crews who understood more viscerally than almost anyone else at sea exactly what freedom was worth fighting to keep. This is not a story that makes piracy noble. Pirates remained violent men living outside the law, and freedom aboard a pirate ship was still a fragile, often brutal thing. But it is a story that forces us to look past the eye patch and parrot version of pirate history and see something closer to the truth, that some of the most feared men to ever fly the black flag were forged not in some tavern brawl, but in the airless dark of a slave ship's hold, where they learned the one lesson no empire could ever unteach them, that they would rather die fighting than be cargo again. That's the story behind the flag today. If you want more of the real history hiding under the pirate legend, the parts Hollywood always leaves out, subscribe and join us for the next voyage. Until then, stay curious, and remember, every shadow on the horizon has a story behind it.